Welcome to episode number 15 of the Just Asia podcast. My name's Kevin O'Shea, and I am a Canadian who has been living and working in Asia for 21 years. And each episode of this podcast, I bring to you the stories, the experiences of very interesting people living throughout Asia. And in this episode, we're going to do the same thing as we've been doing with all the other ones. Another interesting interview with an interesting person. That's right. This week, I am going to be talking to Brian Waters, who is an American based in Japan, Fukuoka, Japan. And hey, you know, if any of you out there listening were fans of my former Just Japan podcast, you'll know Brian because he was on many times. The first episode he was on, I put out a bit of a clickbaitish name. I said CSI investigator in Japan. And, you know, there is some truth to that, but, you know, titles are titles. And he was on many other episodes after that. And Brian was kind enough to come on the podcast to share his life and experiences. Brian works as a forensics instructor at a university in Japan, and his specialty is forensic toxicology. And he did indeed work for the LA County Coroner's Office in the United States, doing the equivalent of doing what would be real-life CSI work, like he said, before the TV show. And before that, he was a JET. He was an English teacher in the JET program. He has a fantastic story. We'll catch up, and when you listen to the interview, you can hear about all of the different times we talked in the past and the different topics. And it was a fantastic discussion. So let's just jump right into the chat with Brian Waters, known as My2Yen on Twitter and Instagram and other socials, about being an expat living in Japan. All right, folks, we're here with another episode of the Just Asia podcast. And you know what? Tonight, it's going to feel like I'm taking a step back in memory lane. And it feels like the Just Japan podcast. And why is that? Because I have a guest that has been on my former podcast, one that you guys may know about or may not know about, the Just Japan podcast. Let me see here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times. 8 times. Brian Waters, welcome to the Just Asia podcast.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for having me back. It's great to be back. Always enjoy talking to you. And lucky number 9, I guess this is, right?
Yeah, I guess so, in a way, in a manner of speaking. So for those who are new, you know, for those who are joining the Just Asia podcast, you know, I've mentioned it before in some previous episodes, but, you know, hey, this may be your first episode. For years, I did have a podcast based in Japan called the Just Japan podcast. Now we're a bit more broad in our, you know, a pool of guests, as in we chat with people who are doing cool things all over the place in this continent. But Brian, you were on. Let's see, I've got it all queued up here. You were on one of the first episodes, episode number 11. Back in April of 2014, and oh my gosh, I can't believe that's when I started that podcast. Called a very, very catchy title, Crime Scene Investigator, CSI in Japan. Ooh, dun, dun, dun. And yeah, you did an episode about episode number 39 where you were building your house. We talked about that. Mm-hmm. Episode 68, right. We talked about putting down roots in Japan as an American settling in Japan with your family. We talked about in episode 91, about having a Japanese spouse, which you do and I do. We talked about in episode number 100, I believe you sent in a recording about your first week in Japan. You talked about your kids' education in Japan, your kids going to school in episode 110. We talked about Christmas stuff and multicultural families in 137. And in 181, you talked about more about raising your family and about schooling in Japan. So wow, we've covered a lot of cool topics over the years.
Yeah.
But when I look at these dates and I see like 2014, you know, I know you've gone through, I'm sure, a lot of changes since then, as has your family. And I guess we'll go into that in a little bit. But before that, for those who may be completely oblivious to my former podcast, the Just Japan podcast, and I'm so thankful all of you for finding me here on the Just Asia podcast. Could you introduce yourself to the people who are listening, our listeners this evening or this morning, whenever it may be, and just let them know a little bit about yourself and where you're from and what you do?
Sure thing. My name is Brian. I live in Fukuoka, Japan, which is in the southern part of Japan. And currently, I'm a senior assistant professor in the forensic medicine department of Fukuoka University. And so, let's see, in 2014, when I was first on Just Japan, I had been at the university for about 3 years. So 2011 is when I started there. And maybe we'll go into it, or people can go back and listen to Just Japan number 11. But I worked at the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office before moving back to Japan, and did that for almost 8 years. And so I have a long history, a long career of doing forensic science and forensic toxicology and forensic medicine. So
very cool, very interesting. One thing I may be dipping my toes into in the future. I was just interviewed on a podcast recently, and I was about insects, and I was discussing with Dr. Jody Green from the University of Nebraska about my future in education and stuff. And I was talking about how I'm planning this fall to start my Master's of Science in entomology. I'm going to be doing that part-time through the University of Nebraska, and that's a goal anyway. And one course I'm very interested in is they offer a forensic entomology course, and that sounds really fascinating. It would be online, so they're doing some like 3D virtual stuff. They basically have they have a place where they have a lot of animals that like pigs and cows and larger things that are dead, and the forensic entomologists do a lot of studying and research into how insects interact with those deceased critters.
Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating field. As a forensic scientist, we kind of see it on the edges because forensic entomologists are basically, they're entomologists first, and then they do the forensics kind of as a side project, because I don't think they would have enough work to do if they were just strictly forensic entomologists. Yeah. So, but when I worked at the coroner's office in Los Angeles, more than one occasion, I had to collect little critters and keep them, store them so that either we could do toxicology on them, and that would be my realm, or they would be sent for a forensic entomologist to look at, under the microscope and all that kind of good stuff. So yeah, it was fascinating.
It's a fascinating topic. Yeah, for sure. So, you mentioned as you're introducing yourself that, when you came back to Japan for the second time, and you mentioned you worked for the coroner's office for 8 years after going back to America. So what did you do in that first time in Japan? For those again who for the uninitiated who may not know who Brian is.
Right. So actually, my coming back to Fukuoka this time was actually my third time. So when I was in college, I'm half Japanese. So I've always had an interest in Japan, and my mother is from Fukuoka actually. So I've always been, interested in the culture and the language, even though I didn't really study it growing up. But when I got into college, I had a chance to do a study abroad. And so I went to Nagoya University, and I did study abroad for 1 year. And I was studying Japanese and applied chemistry. And then, so that was my first time, that first 10 months. And I really, really had fun and enjoyed it. I think it was one of those moments where I got off the plane in Nagoya and was just like, something feels right about this place. It just, everything gels. Like this feels like at home to me. So I went back to undergrad, finished my undergrad degree, and I was looking for routes to get back to Japan, considering a bunch of different things. And the JET program, which probably many of your listeners are familiar with, is just a really good opportunity for a young person to see Japan and experience it while also, getting paid to, they have a job to do, but, and it's more than just English teaching. It's more really about cultural communication international relations, basically. But yeah, so I did 2 years on JET here in Fukuoka. I was teaching at a couple of high schools here, and this is going to come up later, so I'll just go ahead
Yeah,
and
sure.
tell it now. But one of the high schools that I taught at, my daughter is now a freshman at that high school.
Wow.
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
That is crazy.
I can't believe it. All those years ago,
Wow,
roaming those halls.
you were an English teacher there at Jet, and to think of that years later, your daughter would be there as well, roaming those same hallways in a different capacity.
Yeah, amazing.
That is well, yeah. So I mean, you were there as a Jet, and so from Jet to being a forensic pathologist or a forensic scientist, how did that happen? So you left. A lot of us, it's interesting. A few people I've talked to in recent episodes, like they're a lot, it's a common theme, whether it's in Korea or Japan or China. A lot of people who plan to go for 1 year or 2 years or having that gap year, that experience year, that wanderlust year, and then they end up bouncing back to a place or staying for a really long time. And some people go and come back and forth. So how did you make that transition from being an English teacher to working for the LA County Coroner's Office? Because that seems like an interesting thing right there.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I was studying in America. I went to North Carolina State University, and I was studying kind of a weird degree. It was a textile chemistry degree. So in the South, American South, a lot of textile mills. And so NC State, along with a couple of other Southern universities like Clemson, they actually have a college of textiles. So you go and they have courses in textile chemistry, textile engineering, textile design, and then textile management and stuff like that. And so I was there studying textile chemistry, so polymers and fibers and color chemistry and that kind of thing. And then I got bit by the Japan bug. And so, but while I was here on JET teaching, I knew I didn't want to pursue a career in English teaching or anything like that. And that's not really what JET is about, really. I mean, JET is for you to, it serves a double purpose. It's, you're teaching Japanese students English, but you're also experiencing Japan and communicating with, doing international relations with Japanese people. But so I had this chemistry degree and I wanted, to do something with it. So during that time, this was in the late 90s, there were shows like X-Files and those type of, those shows, and they had forensics in them, and so I was like, oh, that would be interesting. I know a lot about polymers and fibers, a lot of crime scene stuff is people picking, hairs and fibers off of, for evidence. Yeah. So I kind of rationalized it that way. And so I started looking for graduate programs, master's degrees programs in forensic science. And during that time, this was before CSI. Mm-hmm. So there really wasn't too many of them. There were a handful. Most of them were on the East Coast. At the time I was dating a Japanese woman who eventually became my wife. And I was like, it'd be nice to live on the West Coast where you get here quickly. And there's a lot of, Japanese people that live in California. So I started looking in California State University, Los Angeles, which is not UCLA. It's California State University, Los Angeles. They had a Master's of Science in Criminalistics. Criminalistics is a word that's synonymous with forensic science.
Okay.
And so I looked into it, and it looked like a good, solid, science program. And so applied and got in, and that kind of started me on the path. And when you study forensic science, in the master's program, you're studying a wide array of things. I mean, forensic entomology is one little part of it. Forensic anthropology, mm-hmm. You got crime scene reconstruction, toxicology, DNA, latent fingerprints, and document examination. I mean, there's such a wide swath of subject matter in the degree program. And then when you start looking for jobs, you're basically just throwing your hat in the ring at any agency that has, forensics. So, for example, LAPD, the crime lab at LAPD, the crime lab at LA Sheriff's, the California State Department of Justice. There are some people who want to go to the FBI and do forensics, or they want to, like maybe a smaller lab right there in California where they, somewhere where they close to where they live, like Long Beach PD or something like that. But you're just applying for everything, any opening that comes up. And then if you get in and get the job, then basically the agency designates, what your specialty is going to be, because it's whatever the lab need is, right? So if the lab needs DNA people, they're going to put you in the DNA program. Okay. Or if they need alcohol, if they need alcohol people, they're going to put you there. If they, need crime scene investigators, they'll put you there. So it just happens. I was applying a bunch of different places, and I got a job offer at the coroner's office. Well, what does the coroner's office do? They do autopsies and dead bodies and forensic toxicology on postmortem blood and tissue samples. So that's what I went into, and that's basically how I became an expert in that field of forensic toxicology. And so doing that for 7 or so years, I never lost that siren song for Japan. Like it kept calling me back.
Yeah.
And I was like, because it's such, this, Kev, because you lived here for so long, but it's such a great place to live. It's just so convenient. And a lot of people, even people who have lived in Japan a long time, a lot of people complain about, the bureaucracy or, other things about Japan. But, those of us that have really made the decision to kind of, live here for a long time or for the rest of our life, we know really the positives and the negatives. And, in my book, and of course it's subjective, but I really think the positives outweigh the negatives. And so, so anyway, so while I was working at the coroner's office, we would come back to Japan because my wife's Japanese and visit family and stuff like that. And every time we came back, I would, go to I visited the police one time, the Fukuoka Prefectural Police, or I went to a university and I would visit a professor there and be like, I work at the coroner's office. I could do a presentation or whatever. And I wasn't really like, asking for a job or anything. I was just kind of putting out little feelers, just networking.
Feelers. Yeah.
Exactly. So, for anyone out there who's like interested in a certain field, doesn't have to be forensics, but be anything, you got to get out there. You got to get your face out there, your name, get your Macy out there, your business card, just hand it to people, anyone who'll take it, and just, and just be pleasant and be knowledgeable. And at the time, like I said, I'd spent 2 years on jet program, 1 year at study abroad. So my Japanese was pretty good. It wasn't perfect or anything. Still isn't perfect. But the people that I meet, I would speak Japanese with them, and they knew my level of Japanese. And so out of the blue, and this was right when we were living in Arcadia, California. My kids were 5 and 3. So my son was in kindergarten and my daughter was in Yochien. What's the not? It's Hoikuen. What's the English word? I keep forgetting my English.
Oh, like daycare or preschool?
Yeah, like a daycare, preschool. And we were like, and I got this just out of the blue. I got this email from the professor at Fukuoka University. He's like, we have an opening. If you're interested, would you like to come work with us? And that was kind of it. It was like, I showed my wife the email and I said, this is it. This is our opportunity to move back. If we're going to move back, it's got to be now, because the kids get a little bit older. They get set in their ways. They get on, certain tracks or whatever. And it's going to be hard to pull them out and pull them away from that. And and so we decided to make the move, and that was 2011. That was right after we moved, 1 week after the big earthquake and tsunami in Fukushima in that area. So that was a huge, like, oh my gosh, what are we doing type of thing. But
Yeah.
luckily
Well,
Fukuoka is kind of far from Fukushima, but
yeah, it's pretty far. I mean, obviously, I'm sure
yeah,
that a lot of your loved ones in America didn't have that concept of where it was geographically. So I'm sure there was
yeah,
a lot of your loved ones and friends and former colleagues and stuff were like, "What are you doing? No, you can't
exactly.
do that."
And then you got Fukushima and Fukuoka, and it's like they thought it was the
It's the
same
same
place.
place, practically the
Yeah.
same. It sounds like it could almost be an episode of Seinfeld. But I mean, so this kind of leads nicely into what I want to ask you next. I mean, so by just doing the math that I'm capable as a kindergarten teacher, in 2014 when I interviewed you, your kids approximately would have been 8 and 5 years old. So they were young when I the first few times you came on the podcast, the Just Japan podcast. And one of the things, some of the topics we did discuss were about, bringing a family over to Japan, setting down roots in Japan. We talked about schooling in Japan. So now what I'm curious about, excuse me, I'm suffering from allergies, constant throat clearing. Everyone, I apologize. Very unprofessional of me. But that's what you get. But yeah, so, I'm curious, where are your kids now in their education careers? What are they up to? You've already alluded, or you already mentioned that you've got a daughter in high school. So, how is a very broad question? How's that experience been going as a parent, as an American, having your children now moving through the school system and getting older?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the last time we talked, they may have have gone into junior high at that point. I can't really remember, but yeah. So I do remember that one time we were talking about the kids and Japanese elementary school, not international school or anything like that, just a Japanese public elementary school, and I remember saying how much that I really liked the system and how it worked and how it was efficient. And I remember we talked about Lambda Cell, and we talked about how they have the little hats and everything's so orderly, and I remember we talked about how you can do that in a country that has such a long history of educating their children in a certain way, and a country that's so homogenous and so systematic, and everything has a purpose. And I still believe that in a way, but I've also come to realize a lot of the weaknesses of the Japanese educational system. And now my son is a third-year high school student, so he'll be graduating next March.
Wow.
And trying to go to college somewhere. And my daughter just started in this past April. She just started at high school. She was a high school first year. So 3 years of high school here in Japan, in a lot of places. And so kind of going back to when we were talking about when my kids were in elementary school, it's just it is very systematic, and they have a certain way of doing things. And then that basically turns into, even starting towards the end of elementary school, it just starts turning into test preparation. That's all that it is. It's just test preparation for every step they have to take in the Japanese education system. And I guess it's similar in other places, but not to the degree that I've seen it here. And my kids it's all public school, public elementary schools. They went to the same public junior high, and they're both in public high schools, different high schools, but both public high schools.
Okay.
And yeah, it's just, you have to know what's going to be on the test and study for that. And then, and if you have to go to juku or cram school to do that, then that's what you have to do. And you know, I I remember saying that there's one way to really grade your the Japanese education system is to look at the adults and to look at the accomplishments that the country as a whole has made. And it's true. Japan has a lot of Nobel laureates. They're leaders of industry in a lot of different, a lot of different facets. And so I do think that the Japanese education system as a whole does a great job of preparing their children for, being successes in the world. But, watching my kids kind of go through that where, they have to study and they can't like be kids sometimes, you know what I mean? They just have to like, oh, sometimes I just want them to go outside and play. But especially my son, he takes his studies very seriously and just sometimes he's just holed up in his room, just, studying. And I'm like, well, I mean, it could be worse, but it could also be better. He could have more, kind of a well-rounded and balanced life, I think. But overall, if I could only give a thumbs up or a thumbs down, I would definitely give a thumbs up to the Japanese education system as a whole. And of course, this is just every situation is different. This is just my experience, but
Yeah.
I think it's done very well to prepare them, for the lives that they're going to lead in the future.
Wow. Very interesting. Wow. And now they're both in high school and getting ready to finish high school in your son's case. That's amazing. My kids started in the public system very briefly. My son just did part of Ichinensei, so grade 1, before we left Japan to move to Beijing for my career. But back in 2020, when we were in Japan for 9 months almost, where the borders closed in China, it got to a point where our kids were studying online from our school in China, and eventually we took them out and put them into public school in Osaka, and they absolutely loved it. My son especially loved it. He's older than my daughter. Just to interact with kids, and it's interesting. The education system is very different than a public system, say in America or Canada, or even an international system, which can often be, depending on what type of school or type of education. I said, that's right. I said education. Oh my God. Even, for example, there's a lot of international schools that use the International Baccalaureate program, the primary years program, which can be very inquiry based, very very focused on independence, or community, working in groups independently from the teacher, with a lot of communication with each other, even at a very young age, becoming really autonomous, having the term agency gets thrown around a lot for kids. And one thing that we interestingly found is that my son, when he was grade 4 or 5, the system in Japan, that kind of the structure just worked so much better for him as a learner. Whereas for my daughter, she hated it. It was so funny because my daughter had come from grade 1 at a very progressive international school where they have like flexible seating where you could sit kind of like on bean bags or bouncy stools and move around the room. You can drink water whenever you want to because that's what people do. Why wouldn't you? And having the freedom kind of move around the room and do stuff. And then for her to get into a grade 1 classroom in Japan where she had to sit in a row, and I remember it was really funny when the teacher was so kind of shocked at one of the first parent conferences where he was just like, she just gets out of her chair and walks around. and like she'll go and drink water without asking. And we're like, I have to have the sit downs with her. Like, you can't do that, Rena. You can't do that, Rena. You can't just get up and get a drink of water. But she's like, yeah, but I'm thirsty. Yes, but you're in Japan now. But some funny conversations. But I'm curious. Like another thing with regards to raising kids, and I think it's something that came up in some of those back episodes of the Just Japan podcast is, I think anyone who is in a international relationship in Japan or anywhere in the world, the languages you use in your house are always, a concern because, especially if you're raising children to be bilingual, you're in a situation where you're in Japan, your wife is Japanese, you're American. You know, it's I'm curious. Obviously your kids were born in America, were raised there for the first few years of their lives, but how has English worked with them over the years? And at this point in their lives, how is their English, or what kind of focus have you put on them? Maintaining English, growing their English. I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it the last time, and it was funny because I remember the way that you phrased the question was, "Well, I assume that you're raising them to be bilingual." And at this point, I don't know. We had been here, I guess, 3 years or so, and I
And by
mean,
the way,
it's
maybe I had just assumed that because after 10 years in Japan, my Japanese was still really poor. So I think I had
no,
to
no, no.
rely on my children to speak English to make up for my lack of effort with Japanese.
Well, no, it was a completely reasonable, question to ask, and I think that, well, to answer your question, my kids' English level is not great. It's really a source of consternation between my wife and I, and especially it's kind of a source of shame for me as a father that I can't whisk my kids off to any English speaking country and have them get around and communicate. But I will say that their English marks. Now, this is compared to all their other friends and other students who most of them have two Japanese parents, are quite good. And I think that's probably because English is around, they're hearing it. Everything I usually watch on TV and listen to music wise is coming at them in English.
Yeah.
So I think, and then they were 5 and 3 when they moved over here. So my son was 5. And of course, both of them were speaking English as their main language when we lived in America. And so, but when they came over here, and it was one of those things where hindsight is 2020, and if we could go back, then we would set rules, and we would say, okay, Brian, no Japanese at all in the house, and just speak English to them and pretend like you can't understand what's being said in Japanese. But the reality is my job demanded a lot of my time. I was literally I would only see them for, maybe an hour, in the evening after I came home. And then, I was working, a lot of weekends as well, half the day or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's true. I mean, I will take the blame. Some things are just easier to communicate in Japanese. I can speak it, I can understand it. And especially if you're disciplining a child or, trying to explain some kind of difficult concept that is important for them to know.
Yeah.
You're just going to default to whatever is easier and whatever will, get the meaning across. And so, shamefully, they don't speak conversational English. My son is better than my daughter just because I think he lived there longer and had more kind of input into his brain at that point. And now when it's at the point where they're both high schoolers and they realize English is an important language and a something that they should learn. And, obviously there's emphasis put on it in the education system here. Especially my son is trying to, speak with me more in English. And sometimes when we're at the dinner table, he'll be quiz me in English. I'll throw out some words and stuff like that. So, so like I said, hindsight's 2020. And if the people listening here want to, have some advice of what not to do, basically is, as much as you can, if you're trying to raise kids bilingual in Japan, speak only English in the house. Even the wife should speak only English in the house, I think. Or the non-Jap or the Japanese partner, whether that's husband or wife. And and pretend like you don't understand them, and just make an effort, like I mean, it would be it literally I'd be it would be like 8:39. I would come home. I would want to eat and just kind of relax before bed and stuff like that. And it's just I just didn't have time to kind of set them down and say, okay, we're going to speak English for 30 minutes or anything like that. That would have done so much to help, but oh well.
Every family is in such a different situation, and I think no matter where you live in the world, when you're in that kind of, international marriage or, relationship, and you're trying to raise children to be bilingual and you have different languages, it's a challenge no matter what. I mean, here I was in a situation when I was in Japan where we would try to have our house English only. My kids were young enough where I'm not like, okay, guys, here's the rule. We only speak English at home, because they were little. But, I
Yeah.
would only speak English, and my wife would pretty much only speak English. And she had to with me because I didn't speak Japanese, right? So I didn't have, yeah, but they were little. And now, for example, flipped 6 years later in China, my kids have Japanese school tomorrow morning. They go to international school. They only use English. Only use English. There's been a big demographic shift in the kind of population and makeup of international schools here in China since COVID happened. I think like in 2019 and earlier, I think you know, for example, at a school I work at, the majority of students would have been English speakers, and English would have been their first language at home, their home language. Um, it probably would have been more than 50% would have identified as English being their home language. Whereas in now, after the zero COVID times in China, where most foreigners left, and then all those seats, those empty seats in schools got filled with local students. So now basically, like even in my own classroom today, I had like my two native English speaking kids were absent. I didn't hear a lick of English. I didn't hear a word of English all day long. I just heard Chinese all day
Mm.
long. My students, Chinese and Korean. I've got a cluster of Korean kids, but I didn't hear any English. Only me and my teaching assistant were speaking English to each other. The kids will speak English to me, my students, for example, when I address them or ask them questions, but with each other, no. But now, like for example, my own kids, they've flipped and they're both native English speakers. And so
Yeah.
now we, for example, have a cable, like a Wi-Fi cable TV box in our apartment where we have 75 channels of Japanese TV, and we only play Japanese TV a lot of the time. But if they're on their iPads, they're watching
Hmm.
English YouTube. They've got Japanese
Right.
school tomorrow for 4 hours. So my wife is doing kokugo with my daughter and son at home when I left to come here and interview you. And but
Mm.
they just do that little by little. And she sometimes laments about like the state of my daughter's Japanese, where she's clearly not a native English speaker or native Japanese speaker. But they're working at it. But it's interesting how that flips. You know.
Yeah.
So here, when we were in Japan, I was really stressed because my kids didn't speak much English, and we were trying to get English into them. Now it's the opposite, where they don't have a lot of. Like, my son's Japanese is still quite good, but I'm sure once he goes back to Osaka next month, when he's talking to his grandparents and other friends, and when he's going to play with some old friends, they'll clearly notice something's up with that Japanese. I think especially his vocabulary or
Mm.
lack of. But
Right.
yeah, it's that interesting struggle that we all face, right? Um,
Yeah.
and there's so many coulda, woulda, shoulda's. But at the end of the day, that's the beauty of hindsight, right? Um,
Right.
it's such a beautiful thing. So speaking of COVID, I mean, now the COVID years are behind us. Kind of most of the world is looking at it that way. Finally, it is here in China. How are things looking for you guys in Japan? I know that Japanese people still seem to have a thing with wearing masks more, even though they're being told they don't have to. They're having trouble letting go. But how have the last, I guess in a nutshell, how have the last few years been for kind of like your family, your work experience, and all that?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, amazingly, like COVID. I mean, one of the great things about Japan is basically the Japanese public. I don't know. It depends on how you look at it, but the thing about the Japanese public is if if the government or if the doctors collectively say wear a mask or get a vaccine or something like that, then there's no real politics to it. It's just basically you do what you're told, that kind of thing.
Mm.
And so, for the most part, it really wasn't an issue. And the thing about Japanese universities, or at least my university, is they will actually, the policies are available. Like they'll come out with a policy and say, okay, if you work in the medical school, which I do, you're still going to be wearing a mask because there's patients of the hospital around, and so that solves it. If that's what the policy is, then that's what we'll do. And so, I mean, I have friends who work here who are English teachers at universities. And as soon as the government said, wearing a mask is optional, man, their mask was off. And it was, some of them still say like, oh, well, I keep it in my pocket and I take it out if I really need it or something like that. But but for the most part, like just today, I would say mask usage on the train, which I take every day in the bus, still probably 80%. Some of the younger people are, kind of not, it's not really rebelling. I mean, they can take it off if they want, so it's not really rebelling, but it's obviously not, an important thing to them. But then again, many of them still are. So, and people get, vaccines when they need to get them. And so it's funny because it seems like the world is just saying, okay, let's just move past this whole COVID thing. And it's going to be like the flu now.
Yep.
And I'm not sure how good of an idea that is. We'll see. But Japan is still kind of, and then again, before COVID, people wore masks during flu season a lot,
Well, I learned the word yobo, I think it is, like the preventative mask wearing. Like when I was, I think I learned that from a high school student. Like when I was teaching in Japan, I was like, "Why are you wearing a mask?
Right.
Are you sick?" And they were like, when I was new to Japan, they're like, "No." Well, then why are you wearing a mask? And they're like, "Well, I don't want to be sick. I've got a big exam coming up. I can't afford to be sick. I'm studying every day until I drop, and I've got this big exam, so I must remain healthy." I was like, "Oh, okay, that makes sense."
Yeah. And it's funny because I was talking. I think a group of guys and I were kind of talking, and we were just like, when people wear masks, and it can be men or women, you're covering up your nose and your mouth. And so, like, for example, for women, if they have nice eye makeup and their hair is done nice, then they're good looking. You can't see past the mask. So I think a lot of young women, well, I'm not going to say just women. I mean, a lot of young people are still wearing the mask, even if they don't have to, because it takes away, 2 chances for someone to, judge you. So, it's interesting.
Well, I can remember even like before COVID when I was living in Japan, some coworkers I'd have would say, I wear a mask in the morning on my way to work because I haven't had time to do my makeup.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
And then I get to work and I can do my makeup in the washroom and I don't have to wear a mask after that. You're like, oh, okay.
Right. I've seen, this is way before COVID. I mean, I started 2011 and there are some women who work in the university who I've never seen without a mask. And I'm talking about, I've been here 12 years. It's interesting. Like, I'm like, why? It's almost like I want to follow them. It's interesting
because like now in like where I'm at in Shenzhen, China, I would say when you go outside and walk around, I mean, we went through zero COVID. When we went through the harshest of harsh, like we were barricaded into our apartment with like, red bollards and barbed wire and soldiers outside and stuff when we get locked down. Like it doesn't get more hardcore than that. And now I'm going to guess when you walk outside in a day, I'm going to guess maybe 10% of people are wearing a mask. Like that's it. Yeah. I mean, even like I walked into, I had to go to the clinic yesterday just because I have bad allergies. I had to get some antihistamines and stuff from my doctor. I can't get the stuff I need over the counter here in China. And I go into this, like, it's a modern kind of clinic that's focused more towards like the expat population. And I walk in, I sit down. I'm like, hey, I got a 4:30 appointment. And then I kind of look around and I realize, oh crap, I don't have a mask. And I look around like I'm like, oh, I'm the only one not wearing a mask here. This is really inappropriate. I'm like, oh. And then I see like on the counter they had a little box of like masks. Please take one if you don't have one. I was like, oh, thank God. Put my mask on. I'm like, okay, that was awkward. And I've even told my kids, I'm getting them ready for like our summer in Japan. I'm like, guys, there's gonna be a lot more people wearing masks in Japan. And when we ride trains, which we'll be doing, we're going to wear masks, because at the end of the day, even if we feel safe and stuff, we can make other people feel uncomfortable, and we should just respect other people. And, sometimes just better to do it out of respect for others. And, sometimes like my foreignness alone and my using English on the train may make some people feel uncomfortable. And then if I'm not wearing a mask, it's going to make them possibly even more uncomfortable. So don't want to deal with that. Just, being able to play. And I do also mention sometimes, there be crazies sometime when you're riding trains in the Osaka, in the Kansai. And that's one less thing to attract their attention as well.
Right.
So, I don't want to keep you much longer because it's getting late into the evening there in Fukuoka where you are. But, one thing that, for those of you out there listening to the Just Asia podcast, Brian is a man of Twitter, and that's where I often interact with him in the Japanese kind of English language Twitter sphere, where he is at my2yen. And one thing that you share quite frequently, and I enjoy seeing, is scenes of baseball stadiums from a fan's perspective. And you seem to partake in baseball games quite frequently. So what's that all about? Have you always been a baseball fan? Is this a new thing since you came to Japan? Were you a baseball fan in the States? And what's that all about?
Yeah, I've been a huge baseball fan ever since I took my first steps. I think
Okay.
There's a picture of me when I'm a little toddler with a baseball glove on my right hand. It's supposed to be on my left hand, on my right hand, and
we don't know these things when we're toddlers. We get your excuse.
Right. Exactly, but I've played baseball my whole life. And I've been a huge baseball fan my whole life. It's by far my favorite sport. And so coming to Japan, when I was a student, I went to Nagoya, and they have a professional team there, the Chunichi Dragons.
Okay, yeah.
And so I was able to go to their games and start learning a little bit about the Japanese Professional League, which is the Nippon Professional Baseball League. And then when I came to Fukuoka also has its own professional team, the SoftBank Hawks. And living here, I have just really taken up the mantle of being a Hawks fan, and I try to go to games whenever I can. And luckily, there's a lot of people around me that enjoy going to the games, so I often get invited, or I will get free tickets somehow. So if you look at my Instagram, or if you look at my Twitter, occasionally you'll see I don't want to call it my signature pose, but I always have like a cup of beer, and then in the foreground, in the background is the field, and so that's kind of like, I've got so many of those kind of pictures, from every time that I go. And usually it's at these home games here in Fukuoka, but I've been to lots of different stadiums here in Japan. Obviously I've been to Nagoya Dome, I've been to Tokyo Dome, I've been to Mazda Stadium in Hiroshima, and a lot of different places. So yeah, it's a great sport. Anybody who's not familiar with baseball and wants to get to know it and become a fan of it should watch the World Baseball Classic games that they just held.
Oh yeah, those
in March.
Yeah, we were glued to our TV.
Good.
Of course, we were glued to our TV. And that was the cool thing about that is like one of the big the big talking points of that whole thing was Lars Newpar. And what was really neat is that his dad Charlie I met through YouTube, and he would come to Japan, and I knew Charlie, I knew his dad from I want to say like back in like 2008, 9, 10, when I was making YouTube videos in Kobe, and I started hanging out with Kansai PJ, who was probably the most prolific guest on the Just Japan podcast, and still a very close friend of mine. And Lars Newbar's dad, Charlie, would come to Kobe and hang out with me and PJ, and we'd go drink beer together and shoot little YouTube videos and hang out and stuff like that. Quite frequently when he would come to Japan on business trips. I believe he had a business selling sporting good equipment and importing sporting goods equipment and stuff like that. So it was really neat to learn that. And and then I followed Charlie for many years on Facebook, and then I know his kids were very serious baseball players through it from childhood up. And then so it was really neat seeing that connection. So when I showed
that is so cool.
Yeah. So that's neat. So Lars Newbar's dad and my wife found that really cool. And like through YouTube, we were friends because back in the day, you remember like back in maybe 2008, 2009, at that time, YouTube was still relatively in its infancy, and it was before there were big superstars of YouTube and big superstar Japan content creators. And, someone like BusanKevin, like I was on YouTube, I still am. There was when I had 5, 10, 15,000 subscribers back in those early days, I guess that was kind of a thing. And when people were watching stuff about Japan or that area, they would come across me, and people would often want to meet up with me and stuff. And again, here I am now in 2023 saying I can watch the World Baseball Classic. And now I see like Lars Newbar on TV all the time and his mom on TV all the time. And you're like, wow, he's a celebrity. Who would have known, right? This is literally just a cool man who was visiting and had a neat little story. And what's really cool about Charlie Newpar, maybe I'll share with you, the channel. He would come to Japan all the time in the 1980s with his friends and travel, and he had one of those big shoulder VHS recorders, like video cameras, and him and his friends would just goof around and film stuff all the time in Tokyo when he was like university age, and he had all those videos. So he created a YouTube channel back in the day where he'd just post these old, essentially they were like vlogs long before there was an internet. And he would post his content. So he's got all these neat videos of him and his friends like exploring the back alleys of Tokyo and hanging out. And what's really neat, when you look at it, you almost would have thought like they were making this for YouTube, but it was in the 1980s.
Way before YouTube.
Yeah, so it's pretty neat. That's kind of a neat little story.
That's cool. So did you ever actually meet Lars? Like when he was like a teenager or something?
No, never met his kids. Only met PJ and I would always meet up with Charlie. We met him like 2, 3, 4 times maybe. Just him. He was just on business trips, and then he would be like up in Tokyo, and then he would like make a little diversion down to the Kansai to come and hang out with us. So it was really neat.
That's cool.
Yeah, kind of neat. So like when things were taking off and I was hearing this name like Lars Newbar, like I know that Newbar. I mean, I know this name, Newbar's Charlie's son. And like I remember like messaging Charlie, like, "Hey, is this just?" He's like, "Yeah." And then I was like, "Wait a second, you're on TV now too, Charlie." Like, oh my gosh, it's really cool. But yeah, so you are on Twitter at my2yen. I guess that's where people. My2yen. So people out there listeners to the Just Asia podcast, you can find the link to that below in the show notes. And are there any other places people can find you, or is Twitter the place to be?
Yeah, Twitter. You could go to Twitter, and if you look at my bio, there's my link tree on there. It has my LinkedIn and everything else, Instagram, Facebook. I'm pretty much my2yen in all those places. So.
Cool.
Feel free to look me up and friend me and interact.
Awesome. Well, Brian, thank you so much for coming on the Just Asia podcast for the first time. And hopefully, I'm hoping that this podcast will be as long-standing or even longer running than the Just Japan podcast was, and you'll be able to come on another bunch of times.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime. And I've been enjoying the episodes so far, so keep them going.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Well, a big thank you to Brian for coming on the Just Asia podcast. I really appreciate it, Brian. Of course, go and follow him on his socials at MyTuyen on Twitter, on Instagram. There will be links below in the show notes. So go give him a follow and see all of the interesting things that he is doing. Well, that's it for this episode. Now, for me, as I record this, I am in my final full week of school here in China, my last school year in China. If you are jumping into episode 15, and this is your first episode listening to the Just Asia podcast, I've been living in China for 6 years and have been through quite a bit with my family during the zero COVID time here in Shenzhen, China. And for a lot of reasons, we've decided it is time to leave. And I have a new job position in Malaysia, Penang, Malaysia, that will be starting in the summertime. But before that, we will be heading off to beautiful Osaka, Japan. And we'll be enjoying the Kansai region of Japan, a little bit of Tokyo, a little bit of Hiroshima, and it'll be great. Then Canada, then Malaysia. So basically, life is frantic, getting everything ready, finishing up school, mostly decluttering before the shipping company comes the first week of November. And that's it. November 12th is our last day in mainland China. That's it. We will be gone. Very, very exciting times. We had a very emotional farewell ceremony yesterday at school to staff who are leaving. And this year there is kind of a bumper year of staff leaving China. And most of them are people who have stuck through some pretty hard times in China during zero COVID, just like we did, and they're on their way. I've worked with some fantastic people at Sheko International School, some truly inspirational educators, good people, awesome people. And I'm gonna miss so many of them. And that is the way it is in this kind of nomadic life of being an international teacher that I am. And I definitely want to get some episodes going with some international teachers to share their experiences. Our experiences are very different than those than you might think. Very, very interesting experiences. Depending on where we live, the students and parents we're dealing with, it's pretty fascinating. Well, hey guys, that is it for me. Thank you for listening. Last week's episode with Sean Morrissey was fantastic, and I've gotten a lot of great feedback about that, talking about the dark side of soul. And this week, chatting with Brian has also been fantastic. Of course, you can follow me on my socials. Follow the Just Asia podcast on Twitter, of course, at Mad for Maple. Follow the official Facebook page, which is at facebook.com/justjapanstuff. I decided to keep that one. Some people have been leaving now that the content is kind of a mixed bag of things that are not just Japan. But you know what? There's going to be a bunch of Japan content coming very soon. Of course, I would like to have you follow me on Instagram at JLandKev or my nature stuff at Shizen Wildlife. On the JLandKev Instagram feed, I put up some reels this week. I was trucking around some different markets and interesting locations in the old Sheko region of Shenzhen where I live. Dropped my son off at his boxing club, and while he was training, I was out going around making some content. Put some new photos up there too, so go check that out. And all these links are, of course, below in the show notes. And follow me on YouTube at BusanKevin, where I've been putting some more shorts up. And go check them out. I've also added more episodes of the podcast. This week I put up episodes 11, 12, and 13 of the Just Asia podcast on YouTube. Takes a bit of time to do that, but I know that there are people out there who are listening who prefer to get their content, to ingest and acquire their content via YouTube. So go over there, check me out at BusanKevin. Well, that does it for another episode number 15. In the bag, in the can, we're done. And thank you so much for listening. Please leave a rating and a review wherever you listen to this. If this is Apple Podcasts, please go give us a rating. Help us get noticed. Spread the word. Help grow the podcast. Word of mouth is still the way to do it. There are no algorithms like in YouTube to help us get discovered. It truly is that kind of traditional way of word of mouth and advertising. So share when I tweet stuff out. If you're a Twitter person, please retweet. If you see this pop up in your Facebook, please repost it, share it in your Facebook. Help us grow. All right, guys, that does it for this week's episode, and I will be talking to you again really soon.